Now, it's important to mention on the front end of this discussion that the ego about which I'm going to talk, and we're going to look at really under a microscope today, is not the idea that Sigmund Freud had, not the ego that Sigmund Freud had. The Freud ego interplays with the id and the superego, and the ego is the mediator between the two. Well, now I don't want you to think about the Freudian ego. I want you to, this is a totally different concept. It's a totally different ego. So kind of wipe your mind clean or something. See what you can do. The ego that I'm going to explain about, and we're going to find out how it affects your belief, is an entity defined by an investigator, a researcher, a great psychologist named Jane Loevinger. And this concept and the fact that it can create development was kind of discovered by her in her research in the middle of the 20th century. The beauty of this concept is not only is it a valid concept, it's been proven time after time after time in research for the last 40 years, but it also has an instrument where you can measure the path of development that the ego takes. So it's a great research tool, and I've been studying and working with the ego for a long time. And let me see if I can conceptualize it in such a way that you can actually see it. I like the idea of holding the ego separately from you. I know that it's not. I know that the ego is a reified notion, and it's just something that we're attaching attributes to. But if you look at it as something separate from yourself, we can really diagnose what it does. We might be able to modify what it does. We can look critically at how it makes its decisions, kind of in a protracted manner. Now, this ego, which is your real decision-making, belief-finding dynamo, takes all the input from everything you see and read and think during the day and melds it into a belief wardrobe, so a set of beliefs, and this creates a platform, which is a platform from which you view life. It's like your perspective, and we all have a little different perspectives on life. We all have little platforms of beliefs made for us by our ego that we float around on and interact with everybody else on a daily basis.
That sounds great. I like to picture it that way.
Okay, let's move along. Now, meaning manufactured by a 4-year-old ego, would certainly look a lot different than meaning manufactured by a 34-year-old ego. The 34-year-old would probably have a lot more complex concepts, might have a broader view of what he is or she is. In the 4-year-old viewpoint,
Well, it's very limited, isn't it? I mean, it's 4-year-old hasn't had that much time and that much input upon which to base his belief system, so it's concerned with real primal things, right?
exactly. Actually, developmental psychologists, and Jane Loevinger was one of them, called this type of thinking that the 4-year-old goes through self-protective stage.
Mm-hmm.
This stage really has a difficult time with sharing. Their idea of what they are is very small, never exceeds their own physical body. That's
Right.
the self to them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me explain an example of spontaneous ego development, where the person, the little ego, switches platforms kind of automatically. As time passes, our little 4-year-old experiences life, has a lot of input from his senses and from his parents, and around 6 or 7, for most people, they experience a change in platforms, they changed perspective, they changed belief wardrobe. Where the little 4-year-old was, well, in instances, this little 4-year-old wouldn't do things wrong because he was avoiding punishment. When he switches over to what they call the conformist stage at the age of 6 or 7, they do what they're told, well, partially because they avoid punishment. But a lot of the reason they do what's told is because they believe that there's a wisdom and authority. This is the stage where girls do girls things, boys do boys things. Very cut and dried, very simplistic view of life. There's no shades of grays. There's good people and bad people. It's a very simplistic view, but everybody has to go through it to develop to the next stage.
Well, I have a question though.
Okay.
I mean, so wouldn't that be more about peer group acceptance than an reverence for authority?
Could be both. Because if you look at the 4-year-old, the peer group acceptance is not there yet. So when they go into the conformist stage, yeah, it's almost like a reverence for the hive mind, respect for authority, tradition. For people that live in their conformist stage all their life, tradition is a big thing.
But less about getting in trouble?
Less about getting in trouble. The idea with trouble is the 4-year-old doesn't want to get in trouble, doesn't want to get his fanny smacked, and so he'll do the right thing. The 7-year-old might see the wisdom in the mummy, in the way the mummy does something, and not do it to stay out of trouble. You get what I mean?
Okay, that makes sense. I got
Okay.
it. All right.
A portion of this change has got to take place in changing beliefs. That's how the ego develops. Now let's fast forward another 7 years in the child's life, and many times, often, the ego spontaneously switches platforms again and moves to another stage in development. Now this stage of development, oddly enough, the one that many people jump into between 12 and 14, is the most commonly held set of beliefs, ego level, platform of beliefs. This is the one that most people in society have, and they keep this all the rest of their lives. Because the ego, even though the ego can develop, it's got much more of a talent at staying the same, and we're going to talk about that a lot in this hour.
Well, okay, wait, but before you do that, tell us a little bit more about what this platform that, most people switch to at about 12 or 14, what does it look like? What are some of the characteristics?
Well, it's real common. It looks a lot like the conformist stage. Jane Lovinger used to call this the self-aware stage. If you could put your head in a 13-year-old girl, teenager, and where she's coming from, that's pretty much the platform. It has a lot of the remnants of the conformist stage. Fashion, they're easily manipulated by fashion because they all have to be the same. Peer group acceptance is really important. I think the difference is you're accepted for different things. I guess in the conformist stage you could say that they were accepted for being exactly like the model. And in the self-aware stage, it's more like the model can be a little bit manipulated by fashion and trend. It's not as traditional, I suppose.
Maybe there's a little more room for creativity within the boundaries of it still being accepted by your best friends or the people that you admire most.
That's right. And deviations, some deviations are a little bit accepted. You can say, well, homosexuality is not good in the conformist stage. On the self-aware stage, you might say, yeah, but my aunt Ethel she seems really great. Another aspect I always like to think of to differentiate this stage from the conformist stage. The conformist stage, there's good and bad, black and white, like that. In the self-aware stage, it's more like cool and uncool
Oh yeah.
to
Yeah.
make the delineation.
I remember when I was 13 feeling like this need to really express myself differently than everyone else. Like it's really strange because maybe I'm quite different than other people at this age, but it was like I needed to break away from the rest of the group and be allowed to express myself as something that was quite different. But it's funny because I know that it was almost like a real drive to not conform, to nonconformity. But when I look back, I still needed some peer acceptance or some group that was more like me, maybe.
Yeah, you were you were using the conforming aspect of the self-aware stage for you not to conform with. So you were conforming with the not conform with, if you know what I mean. I know of a study that was done in the 70s during the height of the hippie era in Haight-Ashbury, and they gave everybody the sentence completion test to find ego level because they were thinking that, oh, these guys will be high ego level because they're so different. But actually, they found that most of them were right on that self-aware stage, and they were just conforming to the non-conformity of the age.
Yeah, that's great.
So, the ego's development from this point, the self-aware stage, as I said before, usually doesn't happen. The ego is usually able to keep those beliefs intact all the way to death. If it does develop, it can develop for a myriad of reasons, but probably the most common is when the ego has a close brush with reality and experiences what I call the dilemma-based model, where they face a dilemma with their less complex, more simplified beliefs, and it just doesn't compute. And if they're lucky, they'll come out of the other side of that dilemma with a little more sophisticated idea of what the world's about, which would probably put them on a higher level platform. Now, examples of dilemmas that your ego is going to find a hard time fitting in with whatever the platform they have might be an alien encounter for a far out version. A less far out version might be encountering someone that actually believes in astrology. But quite frankly, the most common dilemma that shakes the apple cart so much that sometimes, oftentimes I'd say, ego development happens is the divorce. As horrible as that sounds, it's probably the thing that's most spurred ego development in the history of modern man, probably. Let me characterize it this way. This is pure fiction. I'm just as example kind of thing. Let's say that the young couple, the man and the woman that get married to begin with, both have a really idealistic viewpoint of what marriage was, what a woman was, what a man is.
You mean what it's supposed to be?
What it's supposed to be, actually. Probably most of their ideas about marriage and the way it should be came from the Walt Disney Corporation and how they characterized the woman and the man and, this dreamy, eternal, till death do us part kind of thing.
Happily ever after.
Exactly, happily ever after. So they get married and they live in this dream, and in some regard, it would be great if this dream would last forever, and for some people it actually does. But for what I consider to be the more lucky ones, a problem arises. Mismatched expectations, financial problems, infidelity, in-law problems. I don't know how many other problems could arise.
Tons of them.
An infinite number.